Imagine being an ancient Egyptian royal embalmer, facing the most unsettling task of your life. The pharaoh's wife is before you, but this mummification defies tradition. Why? The reason will chill you. This wasn't fiction. Extreme, intimate practices were daily reality in ancient Egypt. Forget what you learned in school. Ancient Egypt had sexual practices so extreme, Victorian archaeologists hid the evidence. Royal children suffered horrific abuse. Religious festivals became week-long orgies. Prepare to question everything. The truth about Egyptian intimate practices is so disturbing, museums hid evidence for a century. Between 3100 BCE and 30 CE, Egyptians along the Nile developed shocking practices. This wasn't just pleasure or ceremony, it was about cosmic control, divine power, sexuality as political weapon. Pharaohs weren't just kings. They were living gods, whose intimate performance controlled the Nile, harvests, survival. Pressure to prove divine potency led to extreme displays. Where's the proof? Temple inscriptions, papyrus documents, concealed archaeological discoveries. 19th century archaeologists were scandalized by explicit imagery. They destroyed evidence or locked it away. Egyptian society believed sexual energy was cosmic. Every act of intimacy was potentially a religious ritual. Every orgasm, a conversation with the gods. Worship and intimacy blurred. What was the dark side? Elite children were religious property. Domestic slaves faced systematic abuse. When the Nile failed, sexual practices became desperate. The game-changing discovery. A quiet lab in 1925. Howard Carter's team examined Tutankhamun's mummy and noticed the boy king's genitals were missing. Surgically removed. Why? Tutankhamun wasn't alone. More royal mummies showed genital removal or modification, castration, enhancement procedures. The tomb of an unnamed prince revealed removal performed while he was alive. Not punishment, but a religious procedure. Ancient Egyptian texts made disturbing sense. Preparing the dead for the afterlife. Modifying the deceased for spiritual function. What were the implications? If Egyptians modified the genitals of their dead, what about the living? Were these purely post-mortem? Most disturbing. Victorian archaeologists hid this evidence. They suppressed explicit imagery. For over a century, modern shame concealed the truth. Missing genitals were just the start. The Egyptian sexual control system operated through a complex hierarchy. Pharaoh's sexual performance was vital. Nobles and priests had to prove worthiness. Domestic slaves, especially children, faced systematic abuse. What about royal children? Ancient Egyptian texts describe how elite families dedicated their youngest children to temple service, training them in sexual techniques from a young age. These children, as young as 6, were taught their bodies belonged to the gods. Training was brutal. Specific positions, techniques for prolonging pleasure, methods for maintaining arousal. They dissociated from their bodies. Medical papyri described the physical toll. Chronic injuries, stunted growth. Many died from injuries or infections. Wealthy families used domestic slaves for pleasure. Legal documents show child slaves bought and sold for sexual purposes. The psychological impact was devastating. Survivors showed severe trauma, difficulty forming relationships, sexual compulsions or withdrawal. They often died young. How was this abuse justified? Priests taught sexual service to the gods was the highest form of worship. Families were encouraged to feel honored. The economic dimension added horror. Archaeological evidence shows a 73% mortality rate among temple children. Wealthy patrons paid premium prices for access to child slaves. This industry of abuse lasted millennia. Think that's the worst? The Feast of Drunkenness was worse. Early archaeologists burned the documents rather than translate them. What's coming will make the previous stories seem mild. This combines religious worship with sexual violence. An entire civilization descended into week-long orgies. Archaeological evidence proves it. The Feast of Drunkenness represented Egyptian sexual extremism. An annual festival for the goddess Hathor transformed the civilization into a week-long orgy of violence, sex, religious chaos. What started as divine femininity became a crime against humanity. The festival's origins lay in the story of Sekhmet, who nearly destroyed humanity in a drunken rage. According to legend, the gods flooded Egypt with beer mixed with red ochre, tricking Sekhmet into thinking she was drinking blood. She became intoxicated, forgot her mission, and transformed into Hathor. This became the template for an annual celebration encouraging Egyptians to drink themselves into divine possession. But there was more than intoxication. Participants believed they became vessels for the gods, free to act without consequence. Preparation began months in advance. Temple authorities brewed massive quantities of beer, adding psychoactive substances. The mixture created hallucinations and lowered inhibitions. Participants reported visions, divine voices, supernatural forces. When the festival began, social rules disappeared. Masters had sex with slaves in public. Married women abandoned their families. Children were exposed to explicit acts. The civilization descended into chaos for 7 days and nights. Ancient texts describe shocking scenes. Intoxicated Egyptians stormed through cities, breaking into homes. Women were subjected to group abuse. Men competed to maintain arousal while intoxicated. Violence matched the sexuality. Participants attacked each other with frenzy, biting, scratching, inflicting wounds. Some died from violent acts. Others were trampled. Religious justification made it worse. Priests taught that any act during the festival was holy. Abuse became communion. Violence became offering. Child abuse became blessing. Foreign visitors expressed international horror. Mesopotamian diplomats saw the festival as proof Egyptians were barbarians. Some kingdoms refused to send ambassadors, fearing for their safety. The festival's aftermath was traumatic. Participants had no memory of their actions. Families were destroyed. Children born 9 months later faced stigma. The economic impact was staggering. Cities shut down. Agricultural work stopped. Trade ceased. Government halted. Pharaohs considered it a necessary expense to maintain cosmic balance. The festival also served political purposes. It provided a safety valve for social tensions. Citizens could rebel against authority, but only during this controlled period. Archaeological evidence confirms the extreme nature. Excavations reveal specialized chambers for group sexual activities. The physical evidence matches ancient accounts. The systematic collapse of Egyptian sexual culture began during the Ptolemaic period. Greek rulers attempted to impose Mediterranean values. The clash between Greek rationalism and Egyptian sexual mysticism created a crisis. The Tammies, despite being foreign rulers, felt compelled to participate, but their Greek sensibilities were horrified. Cleopatra I attempted to modify the Feast of Drunkenness, reducing its duration and imposing limits. These reforms triggered a religious crisis. Egyptian priests feared changing the festival. They thought it would anger the gods. Natural disasters, defeats, and economic woes. Proof the gods were already unhappy. Cleopatra III faced a tough choice: Egyptian religion versus Roman politics. Romans were shocked by Egyptian sexual practices. They saw it as barbaric. But priests threatened rebellion if traditions vanished. Cleopatra made private festivals for priests. Publicly, she kept things modest for the Romans. Nobody was happy. Hypocrisy grew. Egyptian authority and Roman control both weakened. Child abuse became more common. Rulers tried to show devotion while hiding things from Rome. Child slaves were trafficked more. Abuse happened in secret rooms Romans couldn't enter. The psychological impact was huge. Kids grew up thinking sexual violence was normal. When things changed, many Egyptians were traumatized. They lost their understanding of sexuality and the divine. The end came with Roman conquest in 30 BC. Augustus Caesar was horrified. He shut down sexual religious practices. Soldiers destroyed artwork, burned texts, and killed priests who resisted. But Romans didn't just stop it, they erased evidence. Temples lost decorations. Texts about rituals were burned. Even architectural features were destroyed. The children in this system faced a sad fate. Many were conditioned for sexual service. They couldn't adjust to normal life. Records tell of suicides. They couldn't face a world where they had no value. Survivors carried trauma for generations. Abuse created lasting behavior patterns. Roman governors reported underground cults, trafficking, and secret religious movements. But the Romans couldn't destroy everything. What remained shocked Victorian archaeologists. They created a massive cover-up. Victorian morals couldn't handle the truth. In the 19th century, explorers found explicit imagery. This shaped Egyptology for 150 years. Giovanni Belzoni found sexual paintings in a tomb in 1817. He covered them with plaster, instead of documenting them. He described religious scenes, ignoring the sexual content. This was common practice. Auguste Marat kept private collections of explicit artifacts. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo had restricted storage areas for certain items. Only male scholars could access them. Translators edited out sexual content. They used euphemisms or omitted passages. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical text, had 40 sections on sexual practices. They weren't translated until the 1970s. British archaeologist Flender Petrie destroyed artifacts he deemed obscene. He burned papyri, smashed statues, and reburied items. Universities didn't fund research on Egyptian sexuality. Students were discouraged. Journals rejected papers on the topic. Museums hid sexual artifacts. The British Museum has over 2,800 suppressed items. They are labeled as miscellaneous pottery or decorative objects. In 2019, the Louvre hid newly discovered papyri. Wikipedia articles are locked from editing. Visitors face obstacles if they want to see these items. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has similar restrictions. Their galleries show sanitized versions of tomb paintings. The originals are in storage. Only researchers with a legitimate need can access them. This Victorian legacy still shapes our understanding of ancient Egypt. Documentaries and exhibitions focus on politics, religion, and art. They ignore sexual practices. We get a sanitized history. It's far from the complex reality of ancient Egyptian life. This concealment creates gaps in our knowledge of sexuality, religion, and society. The horrors in Egyptian tombs reveal how religious devotion can become abuse. Sexuality becomes a tool of control. For 3,000 years, Egyptian civilization treated children as sexual property. Violence was normalized. Intimacy was used as a weapon.